The moment Ilhan Omar told President Trump on live television that he did not belong in the White House, she made the same miscalculation countless politicians have made before. She assumed the confrontation would follow the familiar script, with moral outrage overpowering facts and identity shielding her from scrutiny. What she failed to recognize was that Trump treats public fights the way he treats business disputes, as contests to be prepared for, not emotions to be survived. She was not challenging a flustered politician reacting in real time, but a veteran showman who never walks into a spotlight empty-handed. From that instant forward, the outcome was no longer in doubt, even if no one in the studio yet realized it. CNN believed it had engineered the perfect television moment. The network framed the event as a serious national conversation on immigration and American values, marketed heavily as a test of leadership and accountability. Ilhan Omar was invited as the counterweight, a progressive voice meant to confront Trump directly and extract viral sound bites. Producers expected sharp accusations about racism and exclusion to dominate the headlines for days afterward. Everything about the setup assumed Trump would be on defense, and Omar would control the moral high ground. Weeks of preparation went into the broadcast. Fact-checking teams were assembled in advance, positioned to respond instantly in Omar's favor if the exchange turned heated. Camera angles were selected to capture Trump's pauses, his deflections, and any signs of discomfort that could be replayed later. The moderator was briefed carefully on how to press Trump while allowing Omar ample room to deliver her arguments uninterrupted. From the network's perspective, the night was designed as a controlled environment where the narrative was already written. What CNN did not anticipate was that Trump arrived with a plan of his own. He walked into the studio carrying a thick, tabbed binder, organized with the precision of a courtroom exhibit. Inside were documents, timelines, screenshots, and records he had been collecting for years. This was not improvisation, but preparation, rooted in decades of dealing with adversaries who underestimated him. Trump had learned long ago that survival in hostile territory depends on receipts, not reactions. His approach reflected instincts shaped in New York real estate, where disputes are settled with documentation and leverage rather than apologies. Over time, those instincts were sharpened by constant conflict with media organizations that he believed misrepresented him. He does not forget personal attacks, and he rarely forgives them. When challenged publicly, he responds by placing evidence on the table and daring his opponent to deny it. That habit, developed outside politics, now followed him directly onto the debate stage. As the cameras warmed up, the contrast backstage was striking. Omar's green room buzzed with activity, staffers coordinating talking points and preparing defensive responses. Advisors rehearsed lines about discrimination and bias, ready to deploy them at the first sign of pressure. Lawyers reviewed boundaries, ensuring nothing she said would create immediate legal exposure. Confidence was projected, but beneath it sat visible tension and reliance on institutional protection. Trump's space could not have looked more different. There were no consultants pacing or lawyers whispering cautions in his ear. He sat alone, flipping through his binder, occasionally smiling to himself as he reviewed certain pages. A single drink rested on the table beside him, untouched. The scene suggested a man about to enter familiar territory, not one bracing for uncertainty. When the production assistant announced there were 5 minutes until airtime, Trump stood calmly and adjusted his tie. His posture was relaxed, the body language of someone walking into his own boardroom rather than a hostile studio. Omar entered first, greeted by applause from supporters and polite acknowledgement from the rest of the audience. She wore an expression of confidence that suggested she believed she understood exactly how the night would unfold. She had challenged Trump publicly many times before and survived each encounter. Criticism had followed, but it had never derailed her career or shaken her standing with allies. This appearance felt like more of the same, another opportunity to reinforce her image as a fearless critic. There was no visible sign that she expected anything different. The atmosphere reinforced that assumption, at least for the moment. Trump followed shortly after, stepping into sustained applause that forced the moderator to pause. He acknowledged the crowd with ease, settling into his seat without immediately looking toward Omar. His demeanor was casual, almost patient, as if he were waiting for something rather than reacting to it. When the moderator began outlining the rules, Trump smiled faintly, signaling that formalities would not shape what was coming next. Civility, he seemed to suggest, would last only as long as it suited the exchange. The opening question was meant to steer the conversation toward immigration policy, but Omar shifted course immediately. She framed her response as a moral indictment rather than a policy critique. Turning toward Trump, she declared that he did not belong in the White House, labeling him a symbol of intolerance and division. The room stirred as she escalated her language, leaning into confrontation within the first minute. She described his presidency as an embarrassment and positioned herself as a representative of the diversity she claimed he opposed. The accusation was direct, public, and personal. In that instant, she crossed from criticism into challenge. For Trump, it was the invitation he had been waiting for. His reaction was not anger, but amusement. A broad smile spread across his face as the weight of her words settled. She had handed him the opening on his terms, not hers. Years of preparation now had a clear point of entry. He responded with unexpected warmth, complimenting her appearance and disarming the tension with humor. Laughter rippled through the audience, easing the edge of the moment. By acknowledging her calmly, he neutralized the hostility she intended to project. The shift in tone caught many viewers off guard. Trump then reframed her accusation, agreeing that the question of who belongs deserved discussion. He leaned back slightly, signaling comfort rather than defensiveness. Before addressing policy or legitimacy, he redirected the conversation to something else she had said in the past. The pivot was subtle but deliberate. At his cue, video footage appeared behind them. The room quieted as Omar's own words filled the studio, played without commentary or interruption. The context was clear, and the phrasing unmistakable. Trump allowed the clip to run its course, giving it space to speak for itself. As the footage ended, he repeated her words slowly, letting each syllable land. The effect was immediate, shifting the emotional center of the room. This was no longer a theoretical debate, but a confrontation grounded in recorded history. The tone of the evening had changed, and there was no turning back. The room absorbed the silence that followed, a silence heavier than applause. Trump spoke again, this time without humor, his voice lower and more deliberate. He described where he was that morning, what he saw, and what the city felt like as events unfolded. His words were careful, vivid, and restrained, avoiding theatrics while anchoring the moment in shared memory. The audience leaned forward, recognizing the gravity he was invoking. He explained why the phrasing mattered, not as a political weapon, but as a measure of respect. Words, he argued, reveal instinct, and instinct reveals character. He did not accuse her of intent, only of carelessness with history. By narrowing the focus to language, he removed the shield of ideology. The effect was to force a reckoning with the record rather than the rhetoric. Trump then broadened the lens, reminding the audience of the country that received her family when they fled instability. He spoke of refuge, opportunity, and obligation, not as abstract concepts, but as a moral exchange. Gratitude, he suggested, is not silence, but seriousness when discussing national tragedy. The contrast he drew was subtle, yet unmistakable. It placed expectations on public servants without attacking identity. As he finished, the applause rose unevenly, spreading beyond his supporters. The moderator attempted to regain momentum, but the exchange had already shifted the narrative. Omar began to respond, emphasizing context and intent, but the energy had changed. Explanations felt smaller once the words themselves had been heard. The audience sensed that the debate had moved from accusation to accountability. Trump did not linger on the point longer than necessary. He transitioned smoothly, noting that public figures are judged not by apologies but by patterns. This was not about a single remark, he said, but about consistency over time. He framed the issue as one of trust, asking whether voters could rely on judgment under pressure. The question hung unanswered, amplifying its impact. The moderator attempted to steer the discussion back toward policy, sensing the imbalance. Trump agreed readily, signaling cooperation while maintaining control. Yet even as policy came up, the earlier moment lingered in the room. Viewers could sense that a threshold had been crossed. The exchange had become a test of credibility rather than ideology. Omar tried to reassert her footing by invoking familiar defenses. She spoke about prejudice and misinterpretation, suggesting that criticism of her language reflected broader bias. The argument landed softly, lacking the force it might have carried earlier. Trump listened without interruption, his expression neutral. When he responded, it was with a reminder that context cuts both ways. He emphasized that accountability does not vanish because a speaker claims good intentions. Public trust, he argued, depends on precision and restraint. By keeping his response focused on standards rather than motives, he avoided escalation. The audience recognized the distinction, even if they disagreed with his conclusions. The moment reinforced his broader strategy of narrowing debates to verifiable ground. As the segment closed, it was clear that the evening would not follow the expected script. The initial confrontation had given way to something more consequential. Trump had reframed the exchange around memory, language, and responsibility. Omar faced a room no longer reacting on impulse. The stage was set for deeper scrutiny to follow. Trump shifted seamlessly, as though the next point had been waiting its turn, rather than interrupting the flow. He spoke about patterns again, emphasizing how public trust erodes when language repeats itself in troubling ways. This time, he did not rely on memory or emotion, but on documentation. He reached for the binder, opening it with deliberate calm. The movement alone drew attention, signaling that what followed would be grounded in record rather than reaction. He introduced the idea that rhetoric leaves a trail, especially in the digital age. Statements do not disappear simply because the moment has passed. Trump explained that social media preserves instinct in its rawest form, unfiltered by later reflection. He framed this not as a trap but as a mirror. What people say when they believe no one powerful is listening often reveals more than prepared speeches. At his signal, excerpts appeared on the screen, displayed without commentary. The words were allowed to stand on their own, dated and clearly sourced. Trump read them aloud slowly, pausing between lines to avoid exaggeration. He did not raise his voice or dramatize the content. The restraint made the exercise feel procedural rather than performative. He then contextualized the language historically, describing why certain phrases carry weight beyond their surface meaning. Words, he argued, inherit consequences from the past, whether speakers intend it or not. He reminded the audience that some stereotypes survive precisely because they are recycled casually. By placing the statements in that lineage, he avoided personal insult while still pressing the issue. The focus remained on impact rather than accusation. Trump noted that criticism becomes different when it repeatedly targets groups rather than policies. He clarified that disagreement with governments is normal in democratic debate. What concerned him, he said, was language that blurs the line between institutions and people. He emphasized that leaders must be careful not to collapse those distinctions. The argument was framed as a warning, not a verdict. As the audience processed the material, murmurs replaced applause. The shift in sound reflected discomfort more than outrage. Trump allowed the moment to breathe, resisting the urge to capitalize on it emotionally. When he spoke again, it was to point out that responses from colleagues mattered as much as the original statements. Institutional reactions, he suggested, reveal how serious the issue truly is. He referenced official responses without editorializing them. Votes, statements, and formal actions were described as facts rather than trophies. Trump framed these reactions as evidence that concern crossed party lines. By doing so, he removed the claim that criticism was purely partisan. The room absorbed the implication quietly. Omar attempted to respond, emphasizing intent and personal experience. Her tone was defensive, but controlled. Trump did not interrupt immediately, allowing her space to finish. When he did reply, it was with a simple observation that repeated controversy creates cumulative doubt. One explanation may suffice once, but repetition strains credibility. He returned again to the concept of responsibility, especially for those entrusted with public office. Influence, he argued, magnifies the consequences of casual language. The binder remained open in front of him, a visual reminder that the record was extensive. The exchange no longer resembled a debate in the traditional sense. It had become an examination of consistency under scrutiny. Trump turned another tab in the binder and signaled that the conversation was moving into verifiable territory. He explained that when public narratives become complicated, timelines matter more than opinions. Dates, filings, and official records, he said, do not argue back. They simply exist. The room grew quieter as screens prepared to display chronological information. He described the sequence carefully, avoiding adjectives and sticking to order. One relationship ended on paper, while another appeared to continue in practice. Legal documents overlapped in ways that invited questions rather than conclusions. Trump emphasized that confusion itself was the issue, not moral judgment. Public officials, he argued, owe clarity to the people who elect them. The timeline appeared visually, clean and restrained, designed for comprehension rather than shock. Trump walked the audience through it step by step, pausing between years. He framed it as an administrative puzzle that had never been adequately explained. The purpose, he said, was transparency, not spectacle. Each transition raised another unanswered question. Omar responded by pushing back on relevance, calling the focus inappropriate. Trump acknowledged the discomfort, but insisted that public trust depends on openness. Personal matters, he argued, become public when they intersect with legal status or public filings. He stressed that he was not declaring conclusions, only highlighting inconsistencies. The distinction was deliberate and repeated. He then addressed the standard for resolving doubt. When accusations are false, evidence clears them quickly. When records exist, releasing them ends speculation. Trump explained that silence, whether strategic or accidental, allows uncertainty to grow. In politics, unanswered questions rarely disappear on their own. They wait. Trump moved next to financial compliance, shifting tone but not pace. He spoke about campaign rules as safeguards for donors, not weapons for opponents. Small contributions, he said, represent trust from ordinary people. That trust requires strict separation between personal benefit and political spending. Violations, when documented, are administrative facts, not personal attacks. Official correspondence appeared briefly on the screen, presented without emphasis. Trump described outcomes without dramatization. Fines, settlements, and acknowledgments were mentioned as records, not verdicts. He noted that resolving issues financially does not always resolve them publicly. Questions often remain after checks are written. The audience reacted less audibly now, absorbing rather than responding. Trump kept his voice even, resisting escalation. He framed compliance as a responsibility shared by all candidates. The implication was universal rather than targeted. That framing widened the relevance beyond the individuals on stage. Omar attempted to redirect the conversation toward broader policy goals. Trump allowed the attempt, then returned to process. He argued that reform loses credibility when advocates ignore their own obligations. Accountability, he said, strengthens policy rather than weakening it. The point landed quietly but firmly. He closed the segment by returning to the binder, leaving it open. The visual suggested that more remained unaddressed. Trump stated plainly that unresolved issues invite scrutiny, regardless of ideology. Transparency ends controversy faster than accusation ever could. The room sensed that the exchange was far from over. Trump closed the binder partway and shifted his focus from documents to tone. He said the issue was no longer paperwork, but loyalty and clarity. Nations, he argued, are sustained by shared allegiance, not by perfect agreement. Disagreement strengthens a country when it begins from commitment rather than contempt. The distinction mattered more than any individual policy dispute. He spoke about identity carefully, avoiding labels while addressing priorities. Public officials, he said, can honor heritage while still placing national duty first. Problems arise when allegiance appears conditional or transactional. Representation requires defending the country even when criticizing it. Without that balance, trust erodes. Trump then referenced past interviews and speeches without replaying them. He summarized patterns rather than quotes, describing repeated framing that cast America as uniquely culpable. Criticism, he noted, is not unusual in politics. What stood out was the absence of affirmation alongside condemnation. A steady drumbeat of negativity, he argued, sends a message whether intended or not. He asked a simple question, delivered without sarcasm. Can a representative articulate what they love about the country they serve? Not a qualification, not a contrast, not a disclaimer. Just a statement of appreciation without conditions. The pause that followed felt longer than it was. Omar attempted to answer by referencing opportunity and progress. Trump listened, then pointed out the immediate pivot back to grievance. He said gratitude that immediately turns into indictment loses its sincerity. Appreciation stands on its own, he argued. The audience registered the distinction in silence. Trump widened the lens to the public watching at home. Millions of people, he said, feel their country is spoken about with disdain by those empowered to represent it. They hear lectures, but not loyalty. They see criticism, but not care. That imbalance, he warned, fuels division more than disagreement ever could. He stressed that pride in country does not require denying flaws. Reform, he said, begins with belief that improvement is worth fighting for. If the nation is portrayed as irredeemable, progress becomes pointless. Love is the engine of reform, not anger. The message was framed as civic philosophy rather than attack. As the segment neared its end, Trump summarized his position plainly. Public service demands accountability, transparency, and allegiance. Identity does not replace obligation, and criticism does not excuse contempt. The office requires seriousness about history, language, and trust. Without those elements, representation rings hollow. The room felt heavier now, not louder. Applause was scattered, restrained, and thoughtful. The confrontation had evolved into an examination of values rather than personalities. Trump remained standing for a moment, then returned to his chair. Everyone understood that the exchange was approaching its final turn. As the closing segment began, Trump addressed the audience rather than his opponent. He said the evening was never about humiliation, but about drawing lines that matter in public life. Evidence, he argued, should not intimidate anyone who believes in transparency. Accountability is not cruelty, and scrutiny is not persecution. Those principles, he said, protect democracy rather than threaten it. He returned briefly to the theme of gratitude, clarifying that it is not submission or silence. Gratitude, in his framing, is seriousness about sacrifice and memory. A nation that forgets its losses, he said, weakens its future. Respect for tragedy is a baseline, not a political preference. Leaders who cannot meet that baseline invite division, whether they intend to or not. Trump acknowledged that America is imperfect, emphasizing that criticism has always driven reform. What separates reformers from cynics, he said, is belief in the country's capacity to improve. Attacking foundations while standing on them creates distrust. Demanding change while denying legitimacy confuses the public. Progress, he concluded, requires both honesty and allegiance. The moderator signaled that time was nearly up and invited final remarks. Omar spoke briefly, returning to themes of bias and misunderstanding. Trump waited, then stood once more, signaling he would not let the exchange end ambiguously. His voice was steady, not raised, and the room quieted instinctively. He said the core question was simple and unavoidable. Public office demands loyalty to the Constitution, respect for history, and openness with the people. When words, records, and patterns conflict with those duties, questions follow naturally. Deflecting those questions does not make them disappear. It only postpones judgment. Trump emphasized that voters ultimately decide credibility, not networks or commentators. Evidence, once seen, cannot be unseen. Language spoken in public carries weight long after applause fades. Records filed with authorities do not change because narratives shift. Accountability arrives eventually, whether invited or not. He concluded by stating that love of country is not exclusionary. It is the common ground that allows disagreement without fracture. Representatives, he said, must be able to defend the nation even while seeking to improve it. Without that foundation, unity becomes impossible. The statement landed quietly, without flourish. As the cameras pulled back, the audience response was mixed but intense. Some stood, others remained seated, but attention was universal. The debate had not ended in slogans or theatrics. It ended with a record placed before the public. Judgment, Trump said, belonged to them. When the broadcast cut, the exchange immediately spread online. Clips circulated rapidly, replayed without commentary. Viewers reacted not to volume, but to substance. The night became less about personalities and more about documentation. The conversation continued long after the studio lights dimmed. In the end, the confrontation changed expectations rather than declaring a winner. It demonstrated how preparation reshapes power in public debate. Words spoken casually can return with consequence. Records, once revealed, redefine narratives. That reality, more than any single moment, defined the night.